Hello, my name is Jakub Lewandowski, and today I'm going to be reflecting on my library entries for the Visualizing Peace project, Semester 2, 2024. The aim of this presentation is to better understand the relationship between diplomacy and peace at both the grassroots and top-down levels, as well as to offer some reflections on how peace building can relate to our individual agency and an understanding of peace through diplomacy. So first, I would just like to introduce the library entries that I'll be referring to throughout this presentation. So firstly, we have Women-to-Women Diplomacy in Georgia, a Peacebuilding Strategy in Frozen Conflict by Magda Lorena Cardenas. Second, we have two complementary settings of peacemaking diplomacy, political elite diplomacy, and public diplomacy by Sapir Handelman. And last, we have The Just Peace, the Public and Classical Diplomacy of the Holy See by Jean Halland Matlery. So first, I would just like to start with some questions I had at the beginning of my learning journey. And these are, well, what is diplomacy? Who is a diplomat? And really, how compatible is the field of diplomatic studies to the more critical understandings of peace, which we frequently come across within the Visualizing Peace project? And my assumed answers to these questions match the very traditional understandings of diplomacy, which is between states and led by political elites. In my eyes, this sort of understanding of diplomacy is almost like a chessboard, with two people across the table, across a chessboard, trying to get the better position in a very rationally calculated manner and extract whatever is best for their own interest. Yet in contrast, diplomatic studies has seen increasing emphasis on people-to-people interaction, or citizen-to-citizen interaction as it's known as well, and this is known as public diplomacy. And I think public diplomacy is an interesting concept to explore further, as it directly links to sort of grassroots peace building and how we understand peace itself. So exploring these two, it's worthwhile to explore these two concepts a bit further and to understand the significant potential of diplomatic studies and how we understand peace. So, traditional diplomacy, as mentioned earlier, occurs between world leaders or professional diplomats who may represent the state and may negotiate formal sort of arrangements in a very top-down manner. And this can create a very sort of unrepresentative sort of peace that does not correlate to sort of societal change, and it can also create sort of negative aspects of peace, such as perpetrator's peace, which is also explored in the Visualizing Peace project. Now, in the context of diplomacy directly, Handelman draws on the Oslo Accords between Israel and Palestine in the early to mid-90s to illustrate the potential drawbacks of traditional diplomacy, calling them a hallucination of their leaders, illustrating the need for public diplomacy at a grassroots level to really create a drive and a public appetite for peace. So public diplomacy, as mentioned, it occurs between citizen to citizen, but it can also be used by states. However, in the context of peace building, I think citizen-led initiatives can drive conflict in a resolution manner in which sort of traditional state-involved diplomacy cannot. Therefore, illustrating that public diplomacy is closely associated to the grassroots peace-building process. And Handelman sort of expands upon this with a series of experiments in Israel and Palestine called the Minds of Peace experiments, which draw together 5 people from Israel and 5 people from Palestine in a room with an audience who is able to interact with the sort of selective representatives of each group. And I use that term broadly because these are just everyday people who are willing to participate in this public diplomacy congress, as Handelman calls it. And a very interesting aspect is revealed, according to Handelman, for these interactions is that sort of radical voices can be moderated based on inclusion and the creation of a sort of inter-ethnic dialogue that ultimately is based on a more democratic principle compared to the traditional diplomacy, which is particularly interesting because Handelman also notes that the Oslo Accords were partly driven down due to radical voices on both sides, sort of who weren't involved in the process, being against it. And I think this partly shows that diplomacy offers an interesting way to conceptualize how we can engage in grassroots peace building, as well as offering the potential tools to do that, so as seen through Handelman's Minds of Peace experiments. And it also draws parallels to other aspects explored by the Visualizing Peace project, such as the contact hypothesis, which I think really captures the kind of individual interaction that occurs in this sort of wider area of public diplomacy initiatives. And I think I would like to sort of complexify this relationship between public diplomacy and traditional diplomacy with Matt Larry's article on the just peace and the Holy See. And I think this is a very interesting example to bring up, as traditional diplomacy rests on this idea that diplomatic actors engage in any sort of negotiation, whether that is peace building or not, based on their own state interests. Therefore, this creates the assumption that if peace is not in a traditional actor's interests, it won't effectively happen, at least at the geopolitical level. And I think the Holy See is unique in the sense that although it is a traditional actor, its interests are not based on the state itself, but on Catholic social teaching. And as part of this, the Catholic Church has its own understanding of peace, which is in a way perhaps comparable to more critical understandings of peace, although not exactly that similar. It does call for a broader social justice and a redistribution of resources during times of conflict, and it calls for the enforcement of human rights and dignity. And to pursue this understanding of peace, the papacy operates on both traditional and public levels of diplomacy. And Matt Larry illustrates this through Pope John Paul's II involvement in the fall of communism in Poland. For example, Pope John Paul II was heavily involved in sermons to his sort of to Catholics across the world, highlighting sort of violations of human rights in the regime, but also directly negotiating with sort of Soviet leaders to prevent the use of force against unionizing workers in Poland. And I think this is a very interesting example to bring up when speaking of peace building, because it shows an example of an institution or a state that is a traditional diplomatic actor, yet engaging in a very unique form of diplomacy that is more associated with the citizen to citizen oriented sort of values and principles rather than state interest itself. So I think this is an interesting case that sort of contrasts the broad distinction between public diplomacy and traditional diplomacy. And I think it's worthwhile to think about where sort of how the idea of Catholic peace actually affects the Catholic Church's actions and understandings of peace. So I think through diplomacy, we can understand how actors, whether they are states or individuals, kind of pursue, understand, and contest peace. So as mentioned on the previous slide was the idea of Catholic peace through Catholic social teaching. But an interesting case illustrated by Cardenas in relation to conflict in the Caucasus is women-to-women public diplomacy. Now, this is a grassroots effort led by women who are traditionally seen as victims in periods of conflict, such as what happened in the Caucasus, but rather these women who are part of organizations such as IDP Consent or actively overturning these assumptions, and being active members of a peace process, actively calling for standards such as gender equality. And Cardenas actually notes how this kind of this inter-ethnic sort of dialogue and sort of unity between women of both sides of the divide between the Georgian ethnic group and the Absbaki ethnic group, which are the two ethnic groups at conflict, can actually potentially have spillover effects, leading to a more formal negotiating process in an area. While there is no ongoing active conflict, there is no peace either, not even at a formal level, never mind at a societal level. And I think what this shows in a way is that through public diplomacy, we can understand how peace is shaped by the sort of individuals leading the process. As the Catholic Church, although its understanding of Catholic peace, is broader and perhaps in some aspects is a good aspect of peace that we should strive for. For instance, in gender equality, which the women in Georgia strive for, perhaps it is lacking, of course, due to the Catholic Church being run, pretty much, really run by men at every level. So I think through comparing different diplomatic actors, we can understand what peace means to each actor, and we can be critical, for instance, drawing on feminist theory in relation to the women in Georgia, to understand why certain diplomatic actors may pursue a peace that is not suitable to everyone, or is not really a true societal everyday peace, but rather maintains certain forms of oppression, such as a lack of gender equality. And I think, on some final reflections on these sort of 3 articles I've broadly tried to draw some reflections from, is that I kind of relating to the sort of citizen-led and grassroots efforts, especially of the women in Georgia. I think public diplomacy can be very, very empowering, and I think, to me, it highlights the potential of the creation of a gap between academia and practice, especially by people who do study peace. And I think, obviously, the women in Georgia are a very unique example in the sense that they are in a conflict zone, and most of us, especially in the Western world, are incredibly fortunate not to live in such circumstances. But I think it is an empowering example to look at and think in terms of our own lives, where for those of us who do attempt to study peace, to think how we can actually transform our studies into the real world, and how we can draw inspiration from people who are perhaps risking their lives, which Cardenas does note security concerns for women participating in organizations such as the IDP consent. For us, where we are safe to express our understandings of peace and pursue a just peace, whether that is at an everyday level, on a wider geopolitical level, I think, to me, it really highlights that we do have perhaps a degree of responsibility to put our academic reflections in practice and engage in the real world to try and promote social change as effectively public diplomats. And at the end of the day, I think what is the importance of using the term or concept public diplomacy? Well, I think it lends a degree of credibility to activism. I think it takes away some of the elite power of the state and its ability to sort of impose peace on the basis of identifying individuals as diplomats. So these have been my reflections on diplomacy and how it can be used to understand peace. I hope you find them enjoyable and enlightening.